Countdown begins. Oh boy. All right. We are live. Back with another live podcast, Joe.
Hello.
And after a long weekend.
Yeah. Posting this link on social.
All good. I'm doing the same thing on the Facebook page. Oh.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wait, hold on. That's the wrong thing.
Looks like your video just dropped out.
My video just dropped? Hold on.
Yeah.
Always something. Cool.
Still recording, just no video.
That is very weird. Actual videos higher quality. It shows me that it's recording me.
Maybe I did something then.
And
Either way, no big deal.
Riverside says it's both things are good here.
Okay. Then it's... Oh, yeah, we're fine. It's back.
Cool.
No biggie.
Okay. There we go. Shall we?
So, kick it off, Joe. This is your book to dive us into, like, our initial first one.
Okay. So today, from On the Genealogy of Morals, Friedrich Nietzsche. It's a kind of a classic bit here. This section that he goes over resentment. You can find this. It's pretty prevalent in a lot of people actually talking about today's day and age. And you'll see why. I was interested because I've seen it in a lot of different places, and I've kind of thought, and I've heard other people talk about this sort of being an age of revenge. The sort of feeling of the time is one of a certain bitterness and attempt at vengeance. That people are always looking to dunk on another person. They're always trying to attack. They're always trying to do these things. And they're trying to deconstruct history in such a way as to tear down the idols of their culture in what seems like an act of bitterness that lacks a perspective, certainly a cosmic perspective, but just simple cultural evolutionary perspective or historical perspective, and seems very much to be fueled not by reason, though there are rationalizations for their behavior, but resentment. Okay, so a little context. When we begin this, Nietzsche is actually writing this book criticizing Christianity. This is part of his barrage against that belief system. And he starts to come up with this idea of a slave morality versus a master morality. And he defines a slave morality as being sort of in opposition to the master morality. Okay, so to begin. The slave revolt in morals begins with resentment. Itself becomes creative and ordains values. The resentment of creatures to whom the real reaction, that of the deed, is denied, and who find compensation in an imaginary revenge. While all noble morality grows from a triumphant affirmation of itself, slave morality from the outset says no to an outside, to an other, to a non-self. And this now is its creative act. The reversal of the evaluating gaze, this necessary orientation outwards rather than inwards to the self, belongs characteristically to resentment. Moving on a little bit. He says of the noble or master morality, they do not have to construe their good fortune artificially through a glance at their enemies, to persuade themselves of it, to convince themselves through lying, as all men of resentment usually do. Likewise, a fully developed people, overladen with strength and consequently as necessarily active people, they knew better than to separate action from happiness. With them, activity is necessarily calculated into happiness. All this is diametrically opposed to happiness, as understood on the level of powerless, the oppressed, of those who suppurate with poisonous and hostile feelings, those for whom happiness appears essentially as narcotic, an aesthetic, calm, peace, Sabbath, the expansion of feeling and the stretching of limbs, in a word, as passivity. Okay. So you can kind of hear what he's getting at there. It's that the first thing that I thought was really interesting about this is that he's contrasting them. He's kind of noting that that people who are resentful are pushing their problems in some sense outward.
Yeah.
That they're not interested in action. They're not interested in making things happen. He talks about passivity, that they're passive. And it's like in their passivity, they have to, how would you say? They almost have to see the active person as immoral. That they blame that person, they look outward, they seem to invert things. It's kind of complicated.
Yeah. It's like an internal versus external, like, or intrinsic versus extrinsic, and how you look at reward systems.
Right. And they don't, convince themselves through lying. Let's see. Let me move on a little bit more, see if it comes more clearly to me. This then is the very opposite of what the noble man does. For the latter conceives the fundamental concept good spontaneously and in advance. That is, from his own point of view. And only then does he proceed to create for himself an idea of bad. This bad of noble origin and that evil which issues from the cauldron of insatiable hatred, the former being a retrospective creation and incidental, a complementary color, while the latter is the original, the beginning, the real deed in the conception of the slave morality. What a difference there is between those two words, bad and evil, in spite of the fact that they both appear to stand in opposition to one and the same of good, concept of good, but is not the same concept of good, which is involved in each case. The question which should be asked is rather, who is actually evil according to the morality of resentment? In all strictness, the answer is none other than the good man. Of the other morality, none other than the noble, powerful, dominating man, but only once he has been given a new color, interpretation, aspect by the poisonous eye of resentment.
Interesting.
So there we go. That makes more sense to me. So it's that those that are resentful look at the good man and blame him, blame him for their lack of happiness, and then define what they call good as the inverse of the morality of the noble person.
Yeah. Because they look at them and say, well, why don't I have that?
Yeah. It's not even just, it's not just like, maybe they say, I don't have that. I wish that there's like an implicit admission that they wish
to be like that person.
Right.
It's like an admiration, but it becomes twisted in the sense that the admiration, it's almost like what he's implying by using slave morality. It's like they will always feel inferior to this good person, whatever the society sets upon. And so all they can do is say, well, I'm never going to be that good, so I'll just hate that person.
Yeah. And like hate even the idea. And it's like it's
Yeah.
just this is evil. Like you see this inversion when people are talking about I mean obviously not always, but you talking about body positivity.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there's nothing wrong with having a realistic expectation of how you look and how you're going to look. If you're an endomorph and you're just built wide like that to some degree, that's just how you are. You shouldn't be envious of somebody in a different position, right? And vice versa. If you're an ectomorph, maybe you have a hard time putting on muscle if you want to. You should take that as it is, right? That there's a healthy version of this, but the unhealthy version is something like looking at the person who is athletic and capable and is a supermodel or is in on Sports Illustrated or something, saying, "I don't have that. I hate that I don't have that. I hate the idea that that is desirable, right? That we are meant to even admire something like that at all."
And then your outcome is you resent like a bodybuilding competition or something like that.
Yeah, and the very idea, and so they flip it, and what they do is they elevate the opposite to the highest order.
Mm.
They say that they put someone who's obese on this recently happened on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and then that's a healthy body image and then to disagree with it is a evil and that you're body shaming.
Right.
And then they say that the athletic former ideal is an unrealistic body standard. So they
like an inversion of the moral compass.
And it's because they resent the fact that that thing is admired, is okay, is good.
It's so crazy because it's everywhere. It's everywhere right now. If you look hard enough for it.
Right. Everywhere. It's the same thing with finding all the characters in history in the Western world, all the heroes of the West, finding the most obscure things that they said,
right,
or things that can be taken out of context, either in the writing or even the historical context, and there's simple recognition that things that people did in the past were more barbaric than we are now, in part because it's a process and we couldn't just emerge right now with the moral understanding that we have. We had to go through being shittier to become better.
Continuum.
Right. But they won't take that. They'll take it out of perspective, out of its context, and then use that to tear down what was good out of a hatred for what was considered good. And it's like, and he gets into this, I think, more.
It doesn't feel like that's a very productive stance. Like the quote that's coming to mind as you're talking about this is actually a Theodore Roosevelt quote. I actually didn't know it was him, but it's the comparison is the thief of joy. And it's like there's a certain amount of comparison that we all do, right? Like that's what leaderboards are. That's what any sort of competition is, right? You have to, I mean, we're also social creatures, so we can't help but compare ourselves to others in whatever realms we're in, right? But there's a limit that we have to set, that a lot of the things that we're in, and this is kind of an old school idea, but we used to see things more as like zero sum games. Whereas if you have a bigger slice of the pie, then everyone else loses a portion of it, which is still true in certain circumstances. But in most of like the average person's life, there's a lot more, there's so much more room for everybody to win, regardless of who you are. And so you don't need to just think that like, oh, because they have, a nicer car or they have whatever it is that you elevate, it doesn't need to turn in this to a resentment thing. It at least that's the way I kind of interpret this.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you're right to say that they think that you're right to say the comparison is the thief of joy, right? And the opposite of that would be something like high tides raise all ships, right?
Yeah.
where you recognize that the success of another person, even if it's indirect, can help you.
Yeah.
It isn't this combative us versus them mentality where their success infuriates you.
Or it means you won't be as successful as they are. Because a lot of the times, the people you compare yourself to are the people you are trying to emulate in some respect.
Yeah.
And so, by the very fact that they're popular or have achieved something that you have come to resent, means there's something about that that you want. And it
Hmm.
may not be clear to you as to what exactly about it, because it's like your emotion is hidden from you to some degree, right? Like it's another parable, but it's like you can see the splinter in someone else's eye but not the log in your own.
Yeah.
And, and it at least strikes me like that kind of parable, because in many respects the reason you resent someone is because they remind you too much like yourself.
It's like, it isn't just that there's something like you, right? Because there are plenty of people who can be just like you who you don't resent.
That's
It
true.
could be people who are equally as, of course, if it can get so bad that you're all just so equally miserable that you all just hate each other, but you all pretend to be friends.
Right, yeah.
That happens. There are people that are in just toxic groups of people that all they do is
Drag each other
complain,
down.
right? And one person starts to succeed and then they rip at that person, make snide remarks, whatever it happens to
Mm-hmm.
be. You can certainly get there.
You
But
see that
it's
in like honor cultures. At least that's what I remember from like at least I haven't read it in a long time, but Hillbilly Elegy, it's like those ideas of when people try to leave like gang places or places where there's like that really tight knit group of people where you have a very specific way of life. As soon as one person tries to ostracize themselves and go toward a more either mainstream or just flip a 180 out of that culture, all of a sudden it's like they start dogpiling on that person, and it's like a gravitational pull to keep people from leaving those
hmm.
cultures.
And it's something like there's a bit of theory of mind going on in here. So
Okay.
theory of mind, just for listeners, is a psychological concept. It's not uh, a theory about minds. It's my theory about your mind. Right? So I have a model in my head of what is your desires, beliefs, and goals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like one of the ways that we start to expand our understanding as human beings of other people is that we become conscious. We become conscious of ourselves. We have an awareness of ourselves. We have a model of our own mind, of our own being. You can have a sense of identity in this way, an explicit sense of identity. I am a student. I am whatever, a lawyer, or whatever it happens to be, right? Uh, and what tells you something about what you are is what someone who fits a similar category reflects back to you, right? So I'm a human being. I see other human beings acting a certain way. That tells me something about what I have the potential to be, right?
Gotcha.
And you can see this in positive ways where that's a role model, is someone, like you're saying, with admiration. You see yourself in them, that they're not so far away from you that you're like, I don't even know what that person's about. That's something like what genius is. Genius is
Mm.
on the positive end. Genius is, uh, I don't understand how you did that. Positively veiled, right? I
Mm-hmm.
don't know how you got there. That's crazy. You're a genius. And then it's opposite. The negatively veiled is the same thing. I don't understand how you did that. You're crazy. That's the negative version, right? It's
Yeah.
why genius and insanity are two sides of the same coin. It's the same thing. I don't understand how you got there. I can't comprehend how you are the way that you are, how you manage that,
Right.
either good or bad.
And that's why there's always a lag time for those people who push culture forward,
Hmm.
because it's so far outside of the paradigm
Right.
that
Right.
either it's a lag the lag time is because people have to sit with it and unpack it, or other breakthroughs need to you know get those stepping stones that are between the genius's theory and the outcome.
right? And basically, by definition, that person who's pushing the paradigm forward has to be, in a sense, incomprehensible.
Right.
Because if you could comprehend it already, then it wouldn't be novel. It wouldn't be pushing
Right.
things forward. It would just be what already is. Right. So obviously there's a line here where it does flip into crazy, where it's incomprehensible in a bad way. Where
Right.
because
That it never makes sense.
right, it never made any sense. And you have to pick apart who the charlatans are from who the real geniuses are
Mhm.
with time, because you're not sure who's who until you spent enough time considering how it is that they're thinking and what it is that they're thinking about. But all this is to say that you're right to say that there's a certain amount of admiration, that it's reactive admiration to a certain character, who you see yourself in, who you see yourself potentially becoming. And your similarity with them is what allows that. But if you're in this hillbilly elegy, I haven't actually read it, but like these these places where you're caught in this toxic group of friends, this toxic culture, then if they watch you, who they think is like them, begin to transcend their negative situation, that suggests to them that they could transcend their situation. And immediately the person admired becomes a representative of judgment. Why aren't you doing better? Do better.
Yeah.
Just by the example, just by setting the example, the person admired, in some sense, becomes someone who crushes, condemns, and they
Yeah.
can't handle the condemnation. So instead of saying, "Wow, that hurts," being inspired or allowing themselves to accept the fact that that hurts, right? Recognizing the sincere emotion. Ow, that hurts, and recognizing it hurts because I believe I can do better. Right? Not they may or may not be thinking anything about you. It's what's happening in your head, right? I'm thinking that they think that I could do better. But that all
Right.
that says is I'm thinking I can do better because I can't
Right.
read their mind.
You're just using what you're a projection of what they're thinking as a surrogate.
Right? To attack the feeling, repress the feeling of
Yeah.
being condemned even by yourself, you invert everything. What they're doing is bad. They make me feel bad. What they're doing is bad.
Right.
And now you're resentful. And now Nietzsche picks it up from there. It's like, woof.
Yeah. It's again, it's like I've heard this before, but it's like whenever someone lashes out, it says a lot more about their internal strife or whatever is going on inside of them than it says about you.
Right. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are judgmental
Right.
and condemning and shitty and whatever. But that does not have to affect you.
Right.
That you can sit in that moment with equanimity and just be settled. And they can try to stir you up, but that is not about you. That's about them. And they might be becoming resentful about you, and you're witnessing the lashing out in this way. They might see it might be I could imagine stories where the person who escapes that world looks back at it and becomes judgmental of the people that they left because they are embarrassed by the fact that they'd ever been there. And in some way they were so adamantly trying to flee this version of themselves that they hated, that to remember their roots is a painful experience.
I've definitely seen people like that before.
And that's something like the inversion of what Nietzsche is talking about, because it's not resentment, right? It's not the same thing as resentment, because that's that
No.
inversion thing, but there's a similar like dynamic going on there.
It's almost like feeling bad for where you came from, even though you've left.
it's like a shame.
Yeah, it feels. Yeah, it's like when resentment turns to shame because it's like, well, it's like it's like mourning, but not like, but you're putting that like mourning, like that sadness onto yourself, and you're feeling like people are gonna look at you differently for having lived that way.
Hmm.
It's like when you see people who've like lived in like poverty and then get out of poverty, they like it almost like it lingers on them.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like they
Yeah, right.
like the people who got went through like the Great Depression and how they can't shake some behaviors.
Yeah, and like that might be like learned. It's something like they've adapted to the scarcity of things, and that
Yeah,
when it becomes maladaptive to some degree when the situation has changed, when the environment has shifted beneath them into a more positive way, suddenly uh, you're kind of hoarding whatever it might be
yeah,
becomes a negative. You know, you're going to sit here and you're going to eat everything that's on your plate. I don't care if you're still hungry or not hungry, right? It's
right,
like it's unnecessary. It's like we're not in a time of scarcity
right. You
anymore.
haven't updated your worldview to match current circumstance.
Right. And especially if it could create in a child the a bad relationship with food. You
Yeah.
could easily imagine that happening. But
Oh,
it's
and there you go, resentment again, all over again.
yeah, and you could any number of things, right? But it's the thing that I think unites these two different sides of this coin. So it's something like resentment that Nietzsche's talking about, which is the witnessing of someone you admire implicitly, someone out there reminding you that you're being condemned, and then a reactive hatred and the inversion and everything that comes from that, right?
Yeah.
But that comes from it's like a looking in order to define what's right and what's wrong. It's not you. It's not recognizing in and of yourself what you feel to be right and wrong, right? And in a similar way, you have the person of shame who's fleeing their shame, looking at something they don't like that they feel associated with, and then defining what's good in opposition to that thing. Good is anywhere but here. And it's not that I think I would prefer that. I would prefer resentment. It's probably more productive, right? It's certainly more productive. But I don't think it's the end state. Right? So maybe it's like transcending resentment into shame, and that's still bad, but it's an improvement because at least you're getting out of bad conditions. You're hopefully improving your life, doing whatever. But the version of that goes even further is where you're no longer defining what's good or bad at all by the circumstances where you came from. It's still external. You see, it's still like outside of yourself. Both of these look to me like a offloading of your conscience onto something in the world, to circumstances beyond you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
And so the optimal version would be just listening to yourself, just it's like a mindfulness that you're noting the passing feelings and not having to attack them or flee from them, but let them be. And that's okay that they're there. There's just a feeling. It doesn't mean you
Right.
have to be possessed by that feeling. And that it's almost like the enlightened person just they make a different choice about what to listen to.
Right. It's like it's almost like you're captivated so much that you can't help but keep looking. You said this over the weekend, but it's like from Lord of the Rings when Pippin grabs the Palantir and he can't stop looking or interacting with the Palantir and he's horrified by it. It strikes me as that analogy where when someone is so bought into the resentment, they can't put it away. It's like a toy or a blanket that is like, in a weird way, it's like comforting for that person who's in that mindset,
Hmm.
because then they don't have to take, personal agency over decisions in their life, because then they can just point the finger and say, well, it's because of that.
Hmm.
This is why I'm not happy, or this is why I can't achieve the things that I want to achieve in my life.
Hmm.
You just get to shut the door and say, I don't even need to try. It's game over.
Hmm. Yeah. Like there's a kind of narrative,
Yeah,
you
like
know?
it almost builds a narrative for it. Like I can see this person who like makes this for themselves, right? Or like chooses to step into that path. And in some ways it kind of branches, like the resentful person is almost like at odds with the stoic person, right? Because in a like it in an engineering way, like stoicism as a philosophy is how to become less negative reactive, right?
Hmm.
And so the idea, and that's almost like what meditation does in an interesting way, but it's like somehow stoicism is like the closest to an eastern philosophy as we've ever gotten. um that's a separate conversation. But that's what I kind of see this aspect of, right? Is like being able to look at that thing that might get like, and it's not to say that you just are like, I'm impervious to any negative thing, right? That's not true at all, right? Go stub your toe and you're going to start screaming, or get cut off in traffic, you might get annoyed, right? But it's almost like that, and this is a Viktor Frankl thing, but it's the how to create the space between the stimulus and the response. And where most people, especially with how fast things come at us in the social media world and everything like that, stimulus and response are literally like on top of each other. If you imagine like a Venn diagram, the overlap is crazy, and we don't have any good way of teaching ourselves how to chill out and be like, I don't need to respond to this right now. You know?
Yeah. I've heard this in when talking about anger management, that
Okay.
they'll talk about how that exact thing, creating more, that you don't have to react, and trying to create more time between stimulus and response. And then
Yeah.
much of anger management isn't actually trying to decrease the anger. It's trying to wait.
Yes. Just
And
wait it out.
just you don't have to. I don't think I've ever gotten to a place where I've been able to sustain that kind of like general peace for very long.
Mm-hmm.
But when it does happen, it very much is a feeling like, oh, I don't have to do anything. I don't
Yeah.
have to say anything. If I want, I could just start spinning around in circles. I can do any number of silly things. There's no real rules. There's nothing actually stopping me from doing these things.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I will anticipate the reactions of people and what their opinions would be if I did something like that. But that isn't so strong a law that I have to regard at any time. And so if I'm sitting in a conversation and it's kind of dull, or maybe I'm nervous about being able to communicate with these people that I maybe don't know, it's nice to recognize that I don't actually have to do anything.
Right.
I'm not under any real obligation. But if I want to say something, then I can do it. And in that way, it's like all of the expectations, all this fade away, and just trying to say something, got to fill the silence. This
Yes.
fades. And instead you can listen. You can just listen and watch, and then it's like you sincerely anticipate
Yeah.
what the person is saying. Not listening in just long enough in order to conjure up a response, right? Not listening for the sake of my response, but listening, and then the response is an organic byproduct of that process.
Yeah. It's an exercise in being present rather than listening until you've heard enough to be able to get to your next talking point, right?
Yeah.
Because that's how so many people operate.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that it's how so many people operate. I understand why. No, it's a very strange moment we're in. It's like
It's
we're
very
so
economical to be in that mode, right? Like we have so many loops that we're just on, right? And you're just in your own loop,
Hmm.
and it's because like our brain is we're trained to respond to the patterns we're comfortable with, right? And so if you just are incentivizing for those patterns you're most comfortable with, that's all you ever go to. And you'll just wait until you hear those things like, oh, and then all those anticipation of reward signals go along, and then you're good. And then you're like, well, I've done what I'm good at. Rather than truly listening to the other people.
huh, yeah, like you're almost chasing a high.
Yeah.
It's like the little dopamine pleasure hit that you get every time you say something you think is smart.
Right.
You're just trying to go after that all the time.
And it's like, to me, just thinking about this in the context of modern sensibilities with resentment, right? I think resentment can be a way for our brains to have novelty all the time in a world where there's so much information out there. What's the easiest thing for our brains to latch onto? Something negative, something that we can resent no matter what.
Hmm.
Because then you can go on any social media platform and find a reason to resent something. I think we're all guilty of this.
That this makes sense to me. You can find there's so much information out there that you can find a near infinite amount to back up anything that you want. And
Right.
so maybe you have just a little tinge of resentment. You're not quite there yet, right? It's a feeling. It's whatever, you're just pissed off that day, and you go online, and if you want, you can look for a bunch of things that will tell you why it is that you're really failing,
Right.
right? That you can use to justify the part of yourself that you're unhappy with, that you're embarrassed about, right? I'm only this way because of the patriarchy. I'm only this way because of, you know, power and oppression and these things.
Right.
I'm only this way because of my parents, because I had that teacher in junior high that put me down in front of the class. Whatever it happens to be, you can find a excuse.
Right. You can have a story to live by, right?
And it might be a good one. Like you might have a really good reason for being the way that you are. Now, just because you can come up with a story about the way that you are, a reason for the way that you are, doesn't mean that's actually the reason that you're that way. We often misinterpret our own behavior. It's part of what makes therapy useful, is that with therapy is in part is having what you're saying reflected back to you from the therapist that highlights in some sense the things you're missing, the things you're not
Right.
considering, that
An
oh man.
unbiased viewpoint on your own life, right? Because it's hard to extricate because you're the focal point of your own story, right? You're living your own experience, so you can't be unbiased about it. It's just the nature of it, right?
Kind of too close to the
Yeah.
situation. And it's not that you can't get there, it's that especially if the reason that you're in a place you don't like is your own fault, and it's something that then the thing that you did was bad, right? By the admission of your own conscience that it's bad,
Yeah.
then that can be hard to admit
Yeah.
because man, sucks to be bad. Nobody wants to have a negative view of themselves. That's understandable.
Yeah.
But if you're not willing or courageous enough to see it, you're putting yourself in a position where of vulnerability to resentment.
Yeah. it makes it even more apparent to me why it's so important to either have really close friendships or significant others, either spouses or, you know, doesn't have to be married, but typically long-term relationships that you can rely upon that are going to be honest with you, because they become vehicles to see your own reflection, to kind of call you on your own bullshit, really,
Hmm.
because they can see things. It's like the Overton window as a concept, because there's things that you can see about yourself that others might not see, but there's also things that you show to other people that you're oblivious to. And
Hmm.
being able to, if they're honest friends, they're going to be like, hey man, you do this thing, you know, maybe it just is just an example that came up right off the top of my head, but like, hey man, you drink a little too much, you know, I'm a little worried about you. And it's like, oh well, I only drink, you know, a couple times, blah blah, you know, and you make excuses for yourself.
Yeah.
And you hand wave it away like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And then it's like, all right, I won't push it. And then you know, over time
Hmm.
they get to see it more and more, and then it's like, hey man, and it's up to the person, right? Like there's only so far that a friend can go or a spouse can go, but there's still, it's like they're still there, and it's important to have the multiple perspectives on these things.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you
Yeah.
get trapped.
And you can be right. And you can right. You can be trapped in your own rationalizations. That's the, oh, it's fine. It's all, I'm not drinking too much. What are you talking about? Oh, it's just a weekend, or well, it's this thing, and you always say it's like,
Yeah,
yeah,
I had a tough week, or I lost my whatever.
right, right. Oh, today was just a hard day at work, and yeah, and then day after day, oh, it turns out every day at work is hard.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, that can be, and it's in weird ways too. It's like you can see self-deprecating stuff
Yes.
that people will say, and it's like, what do you stop? Like a good friend would be like, stop it. It's like,
Right.
don't get into a practice of hating yourself.
Even I feel like self-deprecation is like one of the most insidious things, because it's easy to do it, right? Because it's like, oh, I'm just making like underhanded jokes about myself. They're not that bad, but it's like you say that, you know, 100 times or 1,000 times or more, right? Like through a lifetime.
And it can be, a self-deprecating joke can be disarming and charming, and in good humor, and light. It's not actually self-deprecating. It's just a
Right.
silly. It's an acknowledgement of something silly that you do. Right. It isn't judgmental. It is in a bad way. It isn't this beating yourself down. But there's a type that just is hitting themselves all the time,
Yeah.
and it's like, stop.
It's like a verbal lashing. Like
Yeah.
it's like a subtle thing, but you could tell when it's not just like, oh, I'm being silly, because like it's like the when people give acceptance speeches or something, and they say something like, oh, I'm really not that good, right? Like whatever, but that's different than like you're around a group of friends and you say those things. That's a little bit more biting than it necessarily needs to be.
Yeah, and especially if it kind of feels a little out of context, or like it's almost like they weren't quite listening to the conversation, the natural flow of the conversation, and then
Yeah.
they'll kind of say something sharp about themselves, and you go, where did that come from?
Yes.
It's like, well, it came from them, and they were thinking about that about themselves, and it slipped out. And they cloak it in
Accidental.
humor. They cloak it in humor to make it not so obvious. They don't have to see that that's what they think about themselves. So you don't have to really see it. But and people will do this in other ways. Like I've seen people who have given hints about like self harm. I've seen that before.
Mm.
Uh, that which is tragic. I've seen, this is a rule with dating that I have, that if a woman that I meet goes, ha ha ha, I'm crazy, I take their word for it. I go, okay, noted. Right? There's a certain thing that's like, oh, you couldn't handle me, and I'm like, I don't think I want to.
You're like, I don't think I
Sounds
want to
like
find
you're
out.
a handful.
Problem is,
And
some people like a handful.
yeah, they like a handful for a bunch of reasons. I mean, some of it is that they think that the positive end is that, I forget what book it was, is that I'll remember later, but or maybe I won't. Uh, you only accept the love you think you deserve. I think that's the quote.
Mm.
Gosh, I can just look this up. We're having a.
Yeah. It reminds me of I forget who this might have been in one of Peterson's books, but he talked about this in like relationships with some of his patients he's had, where people tend to have like they end up having a string of very similar relationships that almost all fail the same way
Hmm.
because they haven't reconciled like that initial relationship.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
and they
So
end up go ahead.
sorry. You're talking about the way in which people can be trapped in a loop.
Yes.
Right. We only accept the love we think we deserve. It's from Perks of Being a Wallflower. That's what's from.
Okay.
And so, yes, I think that it's a that phenomenon you're talking about, where they date really the same person 15 different times, right? That's not just that it's who they think they deserve. That's a part of it. I think that's not deep enough. I think that what's going on there is they had some initial. So this is coming out of attachment theory. This is the idea that that infants gravitate towards and rely upon an attachment figure for survival, but that attachment figure is their first introduction to the nature of relationships. So it's the foundation of their further models, right? And so your attachment style as an infant will predict over they've done longitudinal studies your attachment style as an adult. So you'll maintain that attachment style. So that can happen in a couple different ways. It can be a secure one where the infant is, when distressed, comfortable approaching the mother. The mother's good at attending to this, making sure the child is recognized, not neglected. But you can have anxious versions of this where the child is not really sure if they can depend on the mom. Right? So they can be avoidant, like, I'm going to be sad on my own because I can't depend on you. You can have a clingy child that never wants to leave. That's the anxious attachment style. And this goes on to adulthood. So you can have people in adult relationships who are using the first relationship they ever had as a general model for all relationships. Now that can become pathological,
Right.
and that there's a place where a failed previous relationship that went terribly bad can leave someone in a state of something like trauma, and they haven't picked apart the trauma yet. They haven't like gone into it, understood it as what it was, witnessed it, experienced the emotion again. Often when people relive these experiences, they say relive because their brain activates in the same way as it would during the trauma. They have an influx of emotion. Freud talked about this with hysterics, that they had to experience the whole thing again with everything all at once, and then it would finally subside. They could finally get past it. And this has been reinforced by Edna
Sounds like
Foa.
psychedelics.
It is like
too.
psychedelics. And Edna Foa talks. She did clinical research on PTSD and usually
Edna, right? E-D Edna, N-A.
Yes.
Okay. It sounded like you said Ed at first, so I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. Edna Foa.
Okay.
Has done look at this, but it's all saying the same thing. You have to go into it, look at it, make sense of the thing, experience the emotion and all of it, and then eventually you'll pull out something like a life lesson. You'll have learned where you took a wrong turn, what the assumption about this person was, why you held that assumption, whatever it may be. You'll learn what it is where you went wrong. And that tells you how not to do this again.
That's
right?
really interesting.
So that's the positive come full circle. You've escaped the underworld with the treasure or what have you.
Right.
But if you fail to do that, so you don't listen to the trauma, you don't acknowledge it, it's something like repression. You have the memory, it's there. That's where Freud was wrong. He thought you went like you just lost it, like you just didn't know.
It just poofs and goes away.
Right, which was a real problem because then a bunch of people that came after Freud, and I don't know if Freud did it himself, started basically implanting false memories in people because they would see somebody who was traumatized and then assume that it was childhood sexual assault and that they had just forgotten that that was the case, that they had repressed it and gone like just blinked out. And so they would start like goading that, oh, well, did your uncle ever do anything? And then this would progress into you've created a false narrative around what the nature of the trauma was. So that was not good.
It's like leading the witness.
Right. It's exactly like leading the witness, but it's someone who's vulnerable and traumatized.
Right.
Of course, that might also be leading the witness in that case. That being said, they haven't dealt with it. They haven't gone in through the memory and learned everything. So they don't know how to avoid it again. But there's an unconscious, you have to make the what was unconscious feeling and all this conscious.
Yeah.
That's the integrating of these things. If you don't do that, what happens is that your unconscious systems that have not repressed this experience because will continue to deal with it in the only way that they can.
Yeah.
Right. And that's because the unconscious systems are unconscious. You have no control over them. That's the point. Right. These are automated systems that take in stimuli and try to output a response. Right. And so if you're not letting the process go the way that it's organically supposed to go, then it just keeps trying to figure out how to solve the problem without you.
Right.
And one of the ways that that can be is by acting out the situation again in order to map it, to get you to the path you walked, to see where the wrong turn was, where the trip fall was, so that you don't have to make that happen again. But you're acting it out now instead of sitting down and experiencing and thinking it through. So now you compound the trauma by going back to this place, not knowing where the pitfall is, and increasing the likelihood that you'll fall right back into it.
Interesting.
Time and time again. So that's what that is it's somebody who has potentially a bad relationship in the past, who is trying to unconsciously solve the problem of that bad past relationship.
Yep.
And does it by acting it out, which is an unconscious automated system that they have no control over.
And this is like a perfect example for the whole reason this conversation, the whole theme of this conversation with resentment. It strikes me it's the same antidote for resentment is the same thing that happens here, because most people end up resenting that bad relationship, right? And it's like the reason they resent it so much and they're stuck in the loop of resenting it, right, of hating it, and they can't get out of it, and they become a broken record, is because they haven't diagnosed the why, and not just like one why, but like the deepest why.
Yep. That is exactly right. Like, and you can see it too, because I've seen this with some young women that I've come across, that they had their first relationship was very bad and it ended in a way that they don't understand, and it sent them into a spiral.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so maybe the guy was an asshole, maybe they were naive, maybe both, maybe any number of things, right? But in the same way that their attachment model is built up, right? So from your first attachment, your parent, right? And then informed, right? It evolves by its use on another individual. So you're young, you've never had a relationship. The only serious relationship you've had with the opposite sex was a parental one. This is going to sound Freudian because it is, but you approach that. I mean, not quite, because Freud wasn't exactly right in the details. It's not that you approach that person with what you have, what understanding you have, what you know, which is your parent model. You use that to interact with that person. And over time, what happens is that your model that you would expect to have a certain output no longer has the same output. So the fact that your expectations aren't being met in this circumstance suggests that the person you're interacting with isn't the same person as what the model was. So,
Yeah.
right, the simple fact that it isn't working anymore immediately indicates that there's two different things.
Hmm.
Okay, so now it differentiates. So now, boop, now you have a branch on that tree, right? You
Yep.
have parent model and you have whatever this new thing model is. But it can be so malformed, right? So basic, and that at an early level, if you get traumatized there, then the category isn't, in these circumstances, father and boyfriend, it's man.
Right. Just categorically.
It's just all men are the same. All it's just they all belong to
Right.
this category. Your model is not sufficiently differentiated to tell the difference between all these different individuals. It needs to be interacted with more. It needs to grow in the interaction.
It needs more
different
nuance.
and experience. It needs a ton of
Right.
experience, right? That's how it grows,
It's
right?
really interesting.
But if you've broken it at that level and you never went back to fix it, then you can easily see how somebody would just hate all men.
Right.
Because for them, there's no difference between all men. They haven't interacted with men enough to truly understand them in a serious way. And of course, this happens with, on the flip side, men with women, right? They can just hate all women.
Always. Yeah. I mean,
Right.
none of this is exclusive. It's
right. And so what that suggests is that misandry and misogyny are infantile, meaning that you have a infant-like model of men and women that has now been corrupted by some experience, and that you haven't differentiated. So you are infantile if you feel that way, and that the way to fix that is to probably go to therapy, go into the experience and relive it again until you figured out where you went wrong and what was wrong and what the differences between these types of people were. And then you can begin to split it off and understand, oh, there's actually good men and bad men. Or and then when you get really sophisticated, you'll see that there are just people, and that within those people is a series of different impulses and drives, some of which can be good under some circumstances, and some, even the same ones can be bad under different circumstances.
Yeah.
And that's when you get a really nuanced, sophisticated character. And that's how you really understand someone. Now, you don't understand most people at that depth until you've been with them in some kind of serious long-term relationship.
Very long periods of time, typically.
Right, either friends, like you, or marriage or what have you. Right.
Yeah. It's like to me, I've thought about this like recently, with me and you slowly, like you turning 30 and then me approaching 30. Like how does one make long relationships or long friendships, whatever you want to call it with relationships, right? And it's like you don't force it in some sense. It's like there's no point where you're just like, well, we're gonna be friends forever, right? Yeah. like there's no such thing as that. It's just like you just take it one day at a time, and then over months, days, weeks, whatever, and that like slow accumulation of experiences, it's not about like your viewpoint with another person and say, oh, we're friends because of X, Y, or Z reason. And maybe that's how it starts, right? Like we become friends because we like seeing sports games together, right? Whatever sport that you guys gravitate toward. But then over time, because there's enough downtime in the activity of doing that activity, deeper things emerge. And you don't get to those level without giving proper time. Like there's no shortcuts to either good or bad relationships. You just have to it's almost like archaeology in some sense. Like you forge these connections just over like happen chance and just creating a narrative together as either a group of people or as two people, like interweaving their lives together in some sense.
Yeah, you're right. And you're
it all becomes a story.
The archaeology point, you are uncovering each other
Right.
in the thing, and that's a dialogic process, that there's a
Mm-hmm.
dialogue, me and you were talking, and over time you also learn in the interactions with other people where whether they're worthy of trust,
Mm-hmm.
whether you can be comfortable around them, and in that comfort, it's like the guard settles and the sincerity can emerge, but you have
Yep.
to sort of communicate that with that other person, that this is okay, you're in a place where we can just relax.
Yeah. I think this just totally spiked another thought, and I think we should do it in a future podcast that we do. But John Vervaeke had talked about this with Lex Friedman,
Hmm.
and one of the things he sees as like a part of the meaning crisis for the younger generation, like ours, and then not so much ours, but a little bit ours, but also Gen Z, because he's done this kind of research with his students about meaningful relationships. And one of the things that he said is part of the problem is we've basically supplanted the significant other relationship as the thing that has the most meaning, right? Like the thing that used to be religion for most people
Hmm.
has now become that significant other. So that person not only has to be the like home base, but it also has to be the greatest virtue at the same time, which is like something that will fail 100% of the time at some point, right? Because they're not God. Surprise. and and that's kind of what it's striking to me, is like we have to teach young people that you have to have a diverse group of friends, because one person will not meet all your needs, no matter how good it is.
Hmm. Yeah, they can't, they're human being.
Right. They're limited.
Yeah, and I totally see this like, it's this flattening of values,
Yes.
that like there used to be something very high to aim towards, sort of umbrellaed and contained the significant other, and it didn't rob them of their
Importance.
importance in a real sense, or but it put them in perspective, it put them in their proper place, and
Yeah.
you understand that I'm not putting all my hopes and dreams on you. It's, we're two people, and we can just be two people if we have a better place to sort of project that value.
Yes.
That makes sense.
And we could
There's a
totally
bunch of
go.
people that have talked about this. Like,
Yeah, not just John Vervaeke, but he was the most recent one that I've heard talk about that specific part of it.
there was um Chantal del Sol, a French philosopher, wrote a book called
Mhm.
Icarus Fallen, where
Oh yeah, you mentioned this one.
she imagines where the Western world is the place where Icarus would have been had he survived the fall. Right, he had
Hmm.
gone for great heights, got too close to the sun, and then is sent crumbling to the ground. Right, and he lives, and he's there with smoldering ashes and the whole thing, and is wondering, wow, where did that go so wrong? To a place where the very belief in something aspirational rings of impending tragedy.
Mm.
That to She says that the values are aspirational things, right? They're not concrete goals. They're not even something that you can accomplish in your life for. And the fact of striving for these things will improve
Yeah.
your life, right? Even if you never get there. But we had such an optimistic modern view where we thought that we could do anything with the world at all, and that like the world is our oyster, we can manipulate it with impunity, only for the mechanisms in these machines that we created in our hubris to turn on us and to mechanize people, to make them into fodder for concentration camps.
Mm.
And that the same kind of we can do anything means we can do anything. And
It
that
sounds like the manifest destiny taken too far, right? Like once there was no more land to conquer, we started looking at like how do we manifest the things we want in our lives from people and things.
that's like a displacement
Yeah.
in some sense. I mean, obviously, Manifest Destiny was a historical thing, and so
Right.
they
I'm
have
using it
details,
not super proper, but
right? But like as a metaphor, as a general
yeah.
idea that that there's a displacement, but there's like a bunch of consequences that happen when you when you get rid of the aspiration. And it's like the reason we got rid of the aspiration is because we don't trust the idea of aspiring to something at all anymore because of the horrors that we experienced in the 20th century. And so everybody thinks that all high values lead to slavery or lead to the Holocaust or the
or,
Gulag or something. It's like
or the atomic bomb.
we anxiously anticipate the abysmal failure of everything that manifests itself as inspirational to us. It's like, wow, there's that beam of light. I can go there and then immediately go, oh yeah, but what if I get burned? And we're afraid. We're afraid because we don't know what took us there. We don't know why we went so bad.
Yeah, it's the cautionary tale of World War II, right? And it's like, in some sense, we've kind of been afraid to go to that level again. Not to World War II, but to like turn on that machine of, the American dream or whatever you want to call it with progress,
It's
or the idyllic life.
we're as a civilization acting traumatized. It's the same pattern on a different level.
Yeah.
That the traumatized person that hasn't gone and looked at their trauma and figured out where they went wrong conflates a bunch of things, leaving it like the autopsy was never done. It leaves it I don't know where I'm losing the word. Something. I mean, unsomething. And we're doing this. We don't know where we went wrong. So we think that the thing we went wrong with was aspiring.
It's like resenting the even progress at all, or any positive or optimistic outlook at a societal level of like, well, we could go back to right. Like part of the thing is like, my background as an engineer. It's like we got to the moon and then we said, okay, we did it. We're done. We don't need to go back. We've been there, done that. Boring, guys. No need to go back.
Right.
And then we just let it go for 50 years, right? Until now we have people like Elon Musk who and Bezos who are trying to make these rockets and things like that. But it's like the government has abdicated the responsibility to be this force for aspirational goals.
Yes. She talks about that.
Oh,
She literally says that she goes, because we lost aspirational goals. She doesn't use statesman exactly, but it's a good word. We don't have real statesmen anymore because what a statesman did was actually govern. That the point was to guide the ship in the direction to which we were aspiring. It was to help the thing move forward. But because we don't have something to aspire to, all we have are problems. We just have a whole bunch of problems. And because we have a whole bunch of problems and all these things are so complicated, you end up offloading the responsibility that or politicians and what were statesmen had onto experts.
Yeah.
And so you just have a whole bunch of experts that are talking about things. COVID is such a great example. We had Fauci and these characters come up to be the authoritative voice as if they would know what to actually do, because they wouldn't, because being a statesman and being an expert are not the same thing, and that they're not politicians. They don't know how to, a good politician, they don't know how to communicate well with the population, how to rally everyone, how to get us to understand what's happening and to be a point of strength in a difficult time.
Yeah.
They don't know how to do that. So you just have you have calculated lies that you got from Fauci in particular about saying like masks do or do not work. And I think by his own admission, he was calculating like, will these people actually listen? and we need to actually, it's like, oh, I don't think people will leave these masks be. I think the idea was that they didn't have enough supply of masks to provide for frontline workers. So they didn't want to cause a panic and get a bunch of people to go and buy masks for the frontline worker. Right. So he made a calculated lie and said, no, masks don't do anything, when he knew that was not true.
Right.
And immediately betrayed the trust of the population. And then when he had to say, oh, actually they do work, that was it. Nobody believed a word he said from that point on. It was, and I think that he has some amount of responsibility for the conspiracy theorists and the anti-vax people, because his lie set everyone off, and paranoid people. We can't trust anyone. But all this is just to say, right? This is just an example, and people can bicker with me on the details. That's fine.
Right.
Just an example is that what a statesman would have done would have been honest and would have said, here's what we're aspiring to. This is a difficult time. We need to come together and understand that this is going to be hard. We're at one team. We don't have enough supply of masks to help the frontline workers. This is a big problem. If we lose them, then we start losing everybody.
Right.
We need you to be, with the best of our knowledge, at home, quarantine or isolate, whatever it happens to be, and avoid buying masks for now, so that if you have to go to the hospital, there will actually be someone there alive and healthy to help you. That's what a statesman says. But we didn't have those. We just had fixers. Just throw the fixers at these people.
Yeah.
These problems.
You needed the people who can make it feel like everyone has a dog in the race, right? Like, and I think, kind of zooming back out further, right? In the 90s and the early 2000s, instead of the statesman, what came about? You got these rock star entrepreneurs, CEOs, and they became the visionary, the luminary, the people that people aspire to be like, rather than they were the ones with the vision, instead of the people at what would historically have been the government to be that beacon to which, like, here's where we're headed, right? As a society, as a people, as a culture, as a whatever, right? Whatever you want to look at it. And because of that, it's like now with the proliferation of just social media categorically, we there's any number of narratives to pick from, and nobody can agree on the same thing. So that just is a breeding ground to resent somebody for some political view or whatever, right? Rather than looking at it and being like, oh, well, we're all trying to head directionally in the same place. Instead, you get this feel where it's like both sides are trying to just yank the rubber band. It feels like a rubber band, right? And it's like you're pulling it further and further until,
And this is such a time for resentment, because there's so much information out there that no one person can make sense out of all of it.
Right.
I mean, that's always been the case in reality, is that reality just is so complicated. Forget it. But we have so much access now to information that conflicts, information
to spin it.
Just pure complicated, always at your fingertips. And of course, our media has done a horrible job with this, because normally they could just tell you the facts to some degree, try to be as objective as possible, to provide for you some framework for making sense of this cacophony. But instead, that's not even happening. So it's even more confusing. And it's not like people are trained scientists that can read half these papers. And even if they were, it's so complicated that most scientists can't make sense of half of this stuff. So we're in this position where things aren't going well. No one knows why, because it's too complicated to figure out. And so reactively, what they can do is go look for evidence to blame someone. And so it's them, it's the libs, it's the conservatives, it's these rednecks, whatever. I don't care.
Conspiracy theorists, or the
version of
the woke people, or the
It's not that there aren't crazies who are adding to the problem. You'd have to be blind to think that. It's just that it becomes too easy to just hate the crazies on the other side and say that that's and leave it there.
Yeah.
When the onus is on you to improve the world around you, to focus, to get your eyes straight, to focus on where we should head and start rallying people in that direction. Don't look to your side and attack over there. Look forward and
that's the red
pull
right?
everyone with you.
At least as you could start, this is an analogy of a magnet, right? But as soon as you can polarize in the right direction, in a good way, not in a bad way, but like, you get everyone lined up and say, we're going that way. And and once you start doing that, right? And then other people start looking like, wait a minute, it seems like they have a plan. And then people start, but it's not just like there's a right way to do this is what I'm trying to say. It's like, you don't want to point the finger and say, well, it's their fault we're here, and like do that kind of thing. Like, that's like weaponizing resentment. It's more of like acknowledging why we got here without blaming a specific thing and saying, here's how we fix it. Not, well, it's X, Y, or Z's fault, and fuck that guy. Let's go. let's go solve that problem real quick, because that doesn't solve anything. Like, it's short term solve something. Like, you feel good because you've felt like you squashed something, but that doesn't fix the underlying issue. It's addressing like the surface level thing, not the deeper symptom.
Yeah, and it only makes things worse.
Yeah,
it
just makes retaliation possible.
And then you're giving ammunition to the people who are pointing at you.
Exactly. And so you get caught in this loop of resentment, right? Like, then you have one side resenting the other side, and then you never escape it. It's like the idea from I think it was in the 1800s. There was two families called the Hatfields and McCoys who just hated each other's guts from some historical strife for some reason, and it went on for like 50 years or something crazy. And so that's what happens, right? Like, that's where we could end up, and it's in some sense it feels like where we're at right now, and in this crazy resentful world that we're in. And it's like we almost need to teach both sides how to put space between the stimulus and response so that we could stop the bickering for just 2 seconds. And we can actually look at it and be like, okay, we might not agree on a lot, or at least we might not think we agree on a lot, but I think if we try, we can get past it, and we can put that aside and say, how do we actually make a meaningful change?
I agree. And with that, I think we're good. I have nothing more.
That was really good. We just kind of hit a roll.
That was good.
See you later.
I like.
Go ahead, Joe.
I like the way that these are going. That so far it's pick up some piece from a book and see where it takes us and move on. It's neat.
Yeah, it's very fun. It's it feels like improv almost, but very intellectual improv.
Yeah, it's organic. I like it.
Yeah. Well, see you all next week, everybody. And ta-da! And then